All right, today we're talking about a catastrophe that just should never have happened. The collapse of the Sampoong Department Store in Seoul. Now, this isn't a story about an earthquake or some act of God. No, this is a story about choices, about blinking red lights that were ignored, and about the absolutely devastating cost of putting money before people. Let's dive in. 502. Just let that number sink in for a moment. That's how many people died on June 29, 1995. Hundreds more were injured. It was a staggering, almost unimaginable loss of life. And a thing that's so hard to wrap your head around, every single bit of it was preventable. And that's really the heart of the matter, isn't it? The evidence makes it so clear that this wasn't some fluke. It wasn't random chance. This was the predictable, inevitable result of a long, long line of terrible decisions. It was an outcome that was actively chosen.
So to really get a grip on this whole story, we've actually got to start at the end, with the terrifying climax of the event itself, the moment the building just ceased to exist.
I mean, can you even imagine? Less than 20 seconds. That is all it took for a massive 5-story department store, packed with people, to completely fall in on itself. There was no time to run, no time to even figure out what was happening. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone. This description here really gets to the brutal physics of it all. The building didn't just crumble, it pancaked. Each floor slammed down onto the one below it, one after the other. And that created what are called void-free zones, which is a clinical way of saying there were no pockets of air, no spaces to survive. That's why it was so incredibly deadly. Okay, so you have to be asking, how on earth does a modern building get to that point? Well, to find the answer, we have to go way back. We have to rewind the clock, because the seeds of this disaster were planted right from the very beginning. And right here, this is what you could call the building's original sin. See, it was first designed to be a 4-story apartment building. You know, much lighter, not a ton of stress. But then, partway through construction, the owner decided, hey, you know what? Let's add a 5th floor and turn it into a huge department store. The huge glaring problem? They never went back and recalculated the math for all that extra weight, the crowds, the heavy inventory, the massive restaurant equipment.
And if that wasn't bad enough, look at this. This just shows you how deliberate some of these fatal flaws were. To squeeze out a little more shopping space, they literally shaved down the main support columns from 80 centimeters to 60. And that little note at the bottom says it all. That decision alone cut the building's strength by nearly 40%. It's just mind-boggling.
Oh, but they weren't done. Not by a long shot. This was like a masterclass in how not to build something. They used a type of construction that's already known to be a bit risky, but without the proper supports. They cheaped out on the steel rebar inside the columns. And then, get this, years later, they had to move 5 massive 15-ton air conditioning units on the roof. Instead of using a crane, they just dragged them. That sent tiny cracks, microfractures, spreading through the already strained concrete like a cancer. So, all of this brings us to the final day. And this is where the story shifts from just bad engineering to a complete and total failure of ethics. Because the building wasn't just quietly dying anymore, it was screaming for help. This timeline, man, this is just heartbreaking to read. It starts in the morning, just some cracks. But by midday, those cracks are 4 inches wide. People are hearing loud bangs. That's the sound of the structure literally breaking apart. And then, look at this. 5 hours before it collapses, engineers are on site and they're telling management to get everyone out, now. The writing was literally on the wall. And we're not talking about a vague warning here. This wasn't a, hey, maybe you should look into this kind of thing. The experts on site used these exact words, imminent failure. They told them the whole thing was about to come down, that a catastrophe was just moments away. So the big question is, why? Why, with experts screaming that the building is about to collapse, were there still hundreds of people inside, shopping? Well, the answer, it's as simple as it is disgusting. $500,000. That's the reason. That's how much money the store's chairman, Lee Jun, would have lost for that one day of sales. He knew. The engineers told him. But he decided that $500,000 was worth more than the lives of every single person in that building. So what was their brilliant response to a warning of imminent failure? They didn't evacuate. No, they just closed the top floor where the cracks were really obvious and told everyone else to just keep shopping. It was a decision that directly sealed the fate of 502 people. And then it gets even worse. This is the ultimate betrayal. After making the decision to keep the store open, the executives who made that call, they quietly left the building themselves. They saved themselves and left thousands of people inside, completely oblivious to the fact that they were in a death trap. It's a level of cowardice and greed that's just, it's hard to process. Something this horrific, it has to force a change, right? In the aftermath, as rescuers searched the rubble and the world watched in horror, investigators had to figure out how to make sure this could never, ever happen again.
To really understand the how, we need to talk about this concept, normalized deviance. It's a fancy term for something pretty simple. See, every time they took a shortcut, shrinking the columns, overloading the roof, the building didn't fall down that day. So, over time, that incredibly reckless behavior just became normal. It became the way they did things. They got used to ignoring the danger because they'd gotten away with it so far.
But out of all that tragedy, some real, meaningful change did happen. South Korea's building codes were totally rewritten. Negligent owners could now face serious prison time. And maybe most importantly, there was a fundamental shift in engineering ethics. An engineer's first duty isn't to their boss anymore. It's to the public's safety.
Which brings us full circle, back to this idea we started with. This quote just sums it all up perfectly. The second they knew about the danger and chose to do nothing, the collapse wasn't an accident anymore. It became an outcome. It was a choice made through inaction. And really, the story of Sampoong leaves us with this haunting question. It's not just about buildings. It's about, well, everything. When you see warning signs clear as day, at what point does ignoring them stop being a mistake and become a deliberate choice? That's the real, lasting lesson from a disaster that was, from the very beginning, a disaster by design.